He was found lying in the snow, one paw torn and bleeding, his body trembling from the cold, but he didn't move. Not when rescuers called, not when the wind howled around him, because beneath him, sheltered by his body, was a dying fawn. He had stayed through the night, through the storm, through pain, refusing to leave her side. This isn't just a story about a dog, it's about a soul who chose love over instinct, and what happened next changed an entire town. If this story touches something in you, please like, subscribe, and stay with us, because what you're about to see is unforgettable. The wind in Silver Hollow didn't just whisper through the pines, it howled. That morning, the Colorado sky was a white expanse thick with slow-falling snow that blurred the edges of the world. A late winter blizzard had swept down from the Rockies the night before, blanketing the remote town in silence and frostbite. The narrow roads snaking into the forest were nearly impassable, abandoned cars crusted in snow like fossils. But for Madison Harper, it was just another morning of unpacking cardboard boxes and trying not to remember who she used to be. Madison was a 36-year-old woman who carried herself like someone who had learned to live with loss, not escape it, just carry it more efficiently. Her build was lean and angular, not from vanity, but from a life of constant movement. Shoulder-length brown hair was tucked under a faded navy beanie, and her pale blue eyes, once known for their warmth, had since dulled, more observant than expressive. Madison was a former military nurse whose husband, Captain Dean Harper, had died in active service 3 years ago. Since then, she'd uprooted her life in Phoenix and moved to Silver Hollow with her 11-year-old son. She didn't talk about Dean, not to her new neighbors, not even to her son. Some wounds weren't stitched with words. On that morning, Madison had bundled herself in an old army green coat and headed toward the forest trail behind their newly rented cabin. She wasn't walking for pleasure, it was more a habit from her previous life. Inspect the perimeter, stay, alert, look for signs. That's when she heard it. A low guttural growl, more vibration than sound, carried faintly on the wind. She froze. Wild animals weren't rare in these parts, but this wasn't a predator's snarl. It was defensive, strained, protective. She moved carefully through the knee-deep snow, her boots crunching against hidden ice beneath the surface. The sound grew clearer as she followed it, winding between pine trunks and the skeletal branches of dormant aspens. Then she saw it, a massive German shepherd lying in the snow, half buried in frost, his thick coat matted with ice, one side of his body, hunched over something small beneath him. He was not growling at her, not exactly. His mouth was closed, teeth hidden, but a rumble resonated from his chest like the last echo of thunder after a storm. Madison squinted, adjusting her gaze to the stark contrast between fur and snow. Underneath the shepherd's protective body lay a small, limp form, white on white except for faint splashes of red. A fawn. But not just any fawn. Its coat was a pale, ghostly hue, albino, and the blood soaking its hind leg had begun to freeze. Madison dropped to her knees, her breath fogging the air. The dog's eyes, deep amber, sharp and unblinking, locked onto hers. He didn't move, didn't threaten, but every muscle in his body coiled with purpose. "You're guarding her," she murmured. Her voice was calm, steady. She had spoken like this to soldiers under fire, to children in field clinics, and now to a dog trembling from cold, but refusing to abandon his charge. "Okay, I see you. I see what you're doing." The shepherd shifted slightly, allowing Madison a clearer view of the fawn. Its sides moved in shallow, uneven breaths. One leg was clearly dislocated, possibly fractured. The snowy fur was torn where barbed wire had once gripped it, some old rusted fence likely half buried nearby. Madison reached for the radio, clipped to her coat. "This is Harper, requesting urgent wildlife and animal rescue, North Trail, just past mile marker 3. I've got 2 injured, 1 canine, 1 wild deer young, both critical." The response was static and muffled, but she caught a copy, that in a time frame 30 minutes. She took off her coat and slowly crept forward, eyes never leaving the dog's. The wind bit into her sweater, but she didn't care. The shepherd flinched when she moved too quickly, so she adjusted, crouching low. "Easy, big guy. I'm here to help both of you." When she got close enough to touch the fawn, the shepherd didn't lunge. Instead, he let out a soft, breathy groan, more plea than protest, and rested his heavy head on the fawn's neck. Madison pressed her hand gently to the fawn's chest. The heartbeat was weak, fluttery. "You've been here all night, haven't you?" she whispered. She reached out her other hand and gently touched the dog's flank. He didn't pull away, but when she touched near his shoulder, he winced. Blood soaked through a patch of his thick fur. His front right leg was swollen and split, possibly torn on something sharp. That's when she saw the faint indent around his neck, a patch of skin rubbed raw. A collar had once been there. This dog had belonged to someone. Madison didn't speak for a long while. She simply knelt in the snow with them, breathing with them, holding her presence like a blanket. She didn't need to understand what had happened to know that this dog had made a decision. He had stayed, not for food, not out of instinct, but choice. The sound of crunching snow announced the arrival of a second figure, her son. Eli Harper was 11 tall for his age, with soft brown curls that stuck out beneath his wool cap. His face was pale lips slightly parted, and his hazel eyes took in the scene without blinking. A quiet child, Eli hadn't said much since they moved to Silver Hollow. Grief had made him careful, hesitant with people, and silent in crowds. He never cried about his father. He simply drew sketches of soldiers, forests, animals with glassy eyes. He stepped forward cautiously. "Is it dead?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. Madison shook her head. "Not yet, but she's close." Eli crouched beside her, his fingers tightening around the strap of his sketchbook bag. His eyes met the dog's, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not curiosity, not fear, recognition. The wildlife team arrived minutes later, 2 uniformed rangers and a vet tech. Madison helped them stabilize the fawn, wrapping her in thermal blankets, inserting fluids. The shepherd growled once as they lifted her, but Madison placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Let them. She needs this." And he did. Limping on his swollen leg, he followed them all the way to the edge of the woods. "Is he coming too?" one of the rangers asked, hesitating. "Yes," Madison replied. He already decided. She didn't know what possessed her to say it, only that she meant it. The snow began falling harder as the party made their way back through the trees. Madison turned to look at the dog still trailing beside her like a shadow. She didn't know his story, didn't even know his name, but she would. Soon. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and cedarwood. Madison always kept the place clean, not just because of regulations, but because it gave her something to control. The small building sat at the edge of the forest, a converted ranger station with tall windows and low, creaky floors. By late morning, the snowstorm had faded into a quiet gray mist, and outside melting flakes clung to the pine needles like trembling stars. Inside, the warmth was uneven, a space heater humming near the exam table, a coffee pot half full and forgotten. Bear lay still on a thick blanket near the heater, his head between his front paws, eyes flicking toward the door every few minutes. Madison crouched beside him, her fingers moving gently through his fur. What looked like normal matting had concealed more than dirt and frost underneath old scars, ran like faded rivers across his skin, long, narrow lines along his ribs, a ragged wound near his shoulder, and one puckered and pink that curved under his neck where a collar had once bitten too tight. He didn't flinch when she touched them. He just stared at the door. No chip. Madison murmured, shaking her head. No tags, no history. But they tell a story. Bear's ears twitched, but he didn't look at her. He didn't look at anything inside the room, only that door, as if someone might come through it, as if someone should have. Eli sat cross-legged on the other side of the room, his sketchbook open on his lap. He wasn't drawing, just watching Bear in a way most kids wouldn't, without trying to talk to him, pet him, or even make eye contact. Eli understood silence. He lived in it. They didn't find him, Eli asked without looking up. Madison glanced at him. No. I called the ranger's office. No reports of a missing dog. Animal control doesn't have any records either. He's off the grid. Maybe he chose to be, Eli said softly. Madison didn't answer. She pulled a clean gauze strip from the cabinet and began cleaning the swollen paw. Bear's front leg had been wrapped earlier by the wildlife rescue vet, but he had torn the bandage in the car, licking it raw again. She worked quietly, hands steady from years of field work. The kind of steadiness that comes from dealing with patients who don't speak your language, human or not. From the adjacent room came the gentle sound of beeping and muffled rustling snowdrop. The albino fawn had been sedated and placed in a makeshift recovery pen, warm straw beneath her, and a heat lamp above. The wound on her hind leg had been sutured by the rescue team's vet before they left, but her condition remained fragile. She hadn't opened her eyes since they brought her in. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. When Bear heard the beeping, he raised his head. "She's okay," Madison said, "resting." He didn't lower his head again. The door swung open just then, sending a gust of cold air into the room. A woman stepped in short, wide-shouldered with thick dark hair, pulled into a practical bun, and a long down coat covered in snowflakes. She was in her mid-40s with deeply set brown eyes and a voice like boots crunching gravel. "Madison Harper?" she asked, brushing off her sleeves. "Yes," the woman nodded. "I'm Denise Moore, Wildlife Rehab Coordinator. I came to check on the Fawn." Denise had a firm, no-nonsense demeanor. Years in the field had weathered her movements into short, efficient bursts. She walked like someone always on a timeline, and her face bore the tired creases of someone who'd had more calls at midnight than mornings off. Madison led her into the back room. Snowdrop lay motionless under the heat lamp, her pale body too still. Denise examined the vitals, checked the IV, and finally straightened with a sigh. "She's stable for now. Still won't respond to touch or sound. Trauma response likely. Albino fawns are delicate. If she's been isolated from her herd, the psychological shock could be just as dangerous as the wound." She glanced through the window where Bear sat, and he was with her when you found them, protecting her. Wouldn't move. "He's injured too." Denise watched Bear a moment. That's not normal canine behavior. He wasn't just keeping her warm. He was choosing to stay. Madison nodded. "That's what I thought." Denise tapped the clipboard against her hip. "Well, you've got 2 orphans under one roof now. Good luck." Then she was gone, boots thudding down the porch steps. That night the house was quiet again. Madison had brought Bear home with them, setting up a large dog bed in the mudroom, where the tiles were warm from underfloor heating. He didn't use it. Instead, he lay by the back door, eyes fixed on the dark yard beyond. He didn't whine, didn't bark, just watched. Eli stood nearby with a plate of shredded chicken and rice. He knelt, placed the bowl near Bear, and stepped back. Bear sniffed it, then looked up, not at Eli, but toward the hallway, as if expecting someone else. "He's waiting," Eli said. "For what?" Madison asked from the kitchen. Eli shrugged. "Not something. Someone." Bear finally took a bite, slow and mechanical. Madison watched him, brow furrowed, then quietly walked away. The next morning she returned to the clinic early to check on Snowdrop. The fawn had opened her eyes, not wide, not alert, but open. She flinched at the sound of footsteps, but didn't thrash. Progress, however small. She turned to leave and found Bear at the doorway. He had followed her. "Stay here," she said softly. He didn't. When she allowed him in, Bear walked slowly to the side of the pen and lay down, his body curved just enough to face Snowdrop without touching the fence. He didn't move, just watched her like he had in the woods. And Snowdrop slowly blinked toward him, not fearfully, not yet trustfully, but knowingly. The snow had stopped 2 days ago, but the forest still held its breath like it hadn't decided whether to thaw or tighten again. Morning in Silver Hollow came pale and slow. The sunlight filtered weakly through low-hanging clouds. Madison zipped her jacket up to her chin, her gloved hands firm on the leash, though it wasn't really needed. Bear never pulled. He simply walked ahead with quiet determination, his movements purposeful but unhurried, like he was following a memory only he could see. Eli trudged behind them, his sketchbook tucked under one arm and a pencil between his gloved fingers. The boy's eyes weren't on the path. They drifted, capturing silhouettes of branches, broken fences, and the hush of a world half asleep under the frost. His face, framed by his knit hat, looked older than 11, like someone who had held on to silence longer than any child should. They had been walking for nearly 30 minutes when Bear stopped at the edge of a clearing. Madison recognized it almost instantly. The snow had packed down here, a shallow depression littered with broken twigs, smeared blood, and a twisted fence now barely visible beneath a layer of ice. This was the place. Bear stepped forward, sniffing slowly along the fence line, his body tense but not afraid. He paused where the wire bent inward sharply and lowered his nose to a patch of frozen earth. Madison followed, crouching beside him. "That's where she got caught," she said half to herself. Up close the story unraveled clearly. The fence had cut through the snow like a blade, its rusted barbs stained a faint brown where blood had dried. Tufts of white fur clung to the lowest wires. Nearby, deep parallel gouges in the snow, drag marks led away from the fence and stopped at a point where the earth had been disturbed by heavy paw prints. Bear's paw prints. Madison reached out and touched the wire. It bit through her glove with a subtle prick. She pulled her hand back. "He pulled her out," she whispered. "He didn't just shield her. He saved her." Bear stood a few paces away, now his head low-tail still. He wasn't watching them. He was watching the woods beyond the tree line, where the light broke through the canopy in dappled gold. Eli was already sitting cross-legged in the snow sketchbook open drawing. Madison moved closer and peeked over his shoulder. His pencil moved swiftly, shaping the arc of Bear's back as he stood in front of the twisted wire. In the corner of the page, he had started to draw Snowdrop small, crumpled with eyes closed, but the outline was gentle, almost reverent. "You're really good at that," she said softly. Eli didn't reply at first. His eyes stayed on the paper. Then finally I dreamed about him. Before we found him. Madison's breath caught. "Bear?" He nodded. "Not exactly him, just a dog. Big. Standing in the snow. I couldn't see his face, but he was waiting, like Dad used to." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything at all. A few minutes later, they began their walk back. Bear didn't need prompting. He turned from the clearing with a slow exhale and fell into step beside Madison, his massive shoulders brushing her leg now and then like a shadow that refused to leave. Back at the cabin, Madison cleaned Bear's paws with a towel near the fireplace. The snow had hardened into sharp crystals, and the pads of his feet were pink with cold. He didn't resist, didn't move away, just stared at the flickering flames. Later that evening, while Madison prepared dinner, Eli disappeared into his room. When she went to check on him, she found the door half open. His sketchbook lay across his desk, pages filled with more than just dogs and deer. One showed a figure, a man in uniform barely detailed, but with a presence that was unmistakable. Dean. She stepped away quietly, heart tightening. That night, while Bear slept curled beside the door, Madison sat on the couch scrolling through old emails. She opened one from a name she hadn't seen in years. Tom Raines Dean's former partner in the Army, now working with a private K-9 rehab center in Montana. She had emailed him 2 days ago, attaching a photo of Bear asking if he recognized him. His reply had come in the evening. She read it again. "No tags, but he looks like one of ours. There was a K-9 named Brevo retired after losing his handler during a mountainside rescue. He went missing 2 months later, never found. If that's him, he was loyal to the bone. Would have died for the people he bonded with. Maybe he still is." Madison leaned back, the words sinking into her chest like slow-falling snow. If Bear was Bravo, then he had lost his person too. Just like she had. Just like Eli. The air in Silver Hollow had warmed slightly enough for the snow to begin melting along the rooftops, dripping into long icicles that swayed and cracked in the afternoon sun. The forest still held on to winter's breath, but in town, puddles formed on the sidewalks, and the local diner had set out chairs again, half in hope, half in defiance. Inside the clinic, the heat lamp buzzed faintly over Snowdrop's pen. Madison stood nearby, jotting notes into a clipboard. The albino fawn had started blinking more regularly, her breathing smoother, the raw edge of tension slowly retreating from her body. But she still hadn't moved, not until Bear walked into the room. He didn't bark or whine, just stepped across the threshold and lowered himself onto the floor in one fluid motion, resting his massive frame just outside the pen's fencing. He didn't look at Madison. He looked at Snowdrop. And then, barely audible, he made a sound. A low, chest-deep whimper, not of pain, but something else. A call, maybe. A memory. Snowdrop's ears twitched. Her body shuddered slightly. And then slowly, for the first time since she had arrived, she lifted her head. Madison dropped the clipboard. Eli was sitting cross-legged in the corner of the room with a fresh page of his sketchbook. He stopped drawing midline, eyes wide. She heard him, he whispered. Snowdrop didn't rise, but her gaze fixed on Bear, soft and steady. Madison stepped back, unsure whether to intervene or simply witness. Bear let out another low hum, more breath than sound, and Snowdrop blinked again, one slow motion like recognition. That evening word traveled quickly. It started with Molly Griggs, the local mail carrier, who had stepped into the clinic to drop off a package and caught the moment just as Bear's second vocalization stirred Snowdrop again. Molly, a petite woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a habit of oversharing, took no time in calling her cousin, who worked at the diner. By morning, half the town had heard. Some called it a miracle, others an exaggeration, and a few something dangerous. "He's still wild," murmured Carl Dupre over his second cup of coffee at the diner counter. Carl, a man in his late 60s with a deep tan from a lifetime of ranching, had a voice that sounded like gravel in a tin can. He wore plaid shirts and always smelled faintly of chewing tobacco. You can't trust an animal like that. No tag, no history. He's a risk. He saved the deer-countered Angie Keller, the waitress, a tall woman with a thick braid of auburn hair and sleeves of faded tattoos. "Doesn't sound wild to me," Carl scoffed. "It's instinct. Could turn on anyone anytime." Madison heard about the whispers when she stopped for groceries that afternoon. The woman at the register, Rhonda Bell, was a thin bird-like figure with tight gray curls and a perpetual scowl. She'd worked at the market since the dawn of time and didn't believe in surprises. "That dog of yours," Rhonda said, scanning a bundle of carrots he's stirring up talk. Madison raised an eyebrow. "He's not mine." Rhonda paused, eyes sharp. "He follows your boy around like a shadow and sleeps by your back door. If he ain't yours, he's made himself." Madison offered no reply, just took her receipt and walked out into the misty parking lot. But the words sat with her. That night she sat beside Bear on the back porch, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. The snow was melting, revealing patches of pine needles and dead grass, and the trees creaked quietly in the shifting wind. "You're not wild," she said to him, almost absently. Bear didn't react, just kept his eyes fixed on the trees. "You chose her. You didn't run. That means something." Inside, Eli was at the kitchen table bent over a new drawing. He had begun using color soft blue for the winter sky, warm amber for Bear's coat. His sketches had grown more detailed, more deliberate, like something had broken open and started to flow. He looked up when Madison stepped inside. "Is he in trouble?" Eli asked. "Not really," she said, setting her mug down. "But people are starting to ask questions." Eli hesitated, then returned to his drawing. "He didn't do anything wrong, I know," she said, "but sometimes people fear what they don't understand." In the clinic the next morning, Denise Moore returned with another staff member, Dr. Lena Chow, a young veterinarian newly hired from Boulder. Lena was in her early 30s, with sharp features softened by thick-rimmed glasses and a calm, even-toned voice. She wore a green windbreaker and carried a tablet tapping in data as she observed Snowdrop's progress. "She's responding well," Lena said, crouching near the pen. "Still not eating much, but her alertness is improving." She lifted her head when Bear vocalized Madison offered. Denise nodded. "We're documenting it. It's rare but not unheard of. Cross-species trauma bonding has been noted in rescue animals." Bear sat near the exam room's doorway, watching without moving. "You plan on keeping him?" Lena asked. Madison hesitated. "He hasn't let me decide that yet." Later that afternoon, a sheriff deputy stopped by the clinic. Deputy Wade Harlan, mid-40s wide, build close-cropped hair, and a serious face rarely seen smiling. He'd grown up in Silver Hollow, left for 10 years, then returned to take care of his aging father and joined the local department. Wade was not unkind, but he was methodical, always considering worst-case scenarios. "Just doing a courtesy check," he said, as Madison led him inside. "Got some folks nervous." Carl Dupree filed a report about what she asked, already knowing the answer. "The dog says he wants animal control involved." Madison folded her arms. "He's not a threat. You're welcome to see for yourself." Wade stepped into the exam room, looked at Bear, who was now lying beside the desk with his chin resting on his paws. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. Wade crouched low. "Hey, boy." Bear flicked one ear. Wade stood again. "He's seen something. You can tell. Dogs like this. They've been through hell." Madison nodded. He lost his handler. Wade exhaled. "That'll do it." He looked around once more, then tipped his hat. "I'll log the visit, but keep him close. Silver Hollow's got a long memory when it comes to animals that don't fit the mold." When he left, Madison sat with Bear on the floor and whispered, "It's not your job to be understood. Just stay. Just stay here." Bear nudged her hand once gently, then returned his gaze to the door. The snow had nearly melted from the sidewalks of Silver Hollow, and the first hesitant crocuses had begun to press through the thawing ground. The forest smelled of damp bark and soft moss, and though the wind still bit through coats, it no longer felt punishing. Something was shifting not just in the weather, but in the small spaces people left unguarded. Even Madison noticed it. Her front porch no longer felt like a threshold she couldn't cross. At the clinic that morning, she stood beside the recovery pen, watching Snowdrop chew slowly on a handful of wet hay. The fawn's wounds were healing, but her progress had stalled emotionally. She flinched at loud sounds, refused food, unless coaxed for long minutes, and startled at every new face except Bear's. So, Madison made a decision. She called Denise Moore and requested a supervised reintroduction, not a full interaction, but a controlled visit between Bear and Snowdrop, with a fence between them. Denise hesitated, but eventually agreed. "If it helps her stabilize, it's worth a try," she said. But one wrong move, and we ended. The meeting was set for Saturday morning, in the outer enclosure of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. It was a modest facility built into the edge of the forest, a mix of wooden pens and open grass areas bordered by chain-link fence. That morning, the air was crisp, the clouds brushed with gold, and frost glittered on the wooden walkways. Madison arrived early with Bear and Eli. Bear walked steadily beside her, not straining at the leash, but clearly alert. His body was calm, but his ears twitched at each movement beyond the trees. Eli carried his sketchbook under one arm and a thermos of hot tea in the other. The boy's cheeks were flushed pink, and his scarf trailed behind him, like a flag in retreat. He had started talking more. Lately, not a lot, not about his father, but enough. He told Madison what Bear did at night, how he sometimes pressed his nose to Eli's door but never came in, how he stayed nearby as if he knew the boy needed space, not company. At the gate, Denise met them with a clipboard and a guarded expression. Behind her stood a man Madison hadn't met yet. Nico Alvarez, a rehabilitation specialist recently transferred from California. Nico was in his late 20s, lean and broad-shouldered, with warm skin, curly black hair, and a calm energy that made animals settle when he entered a room. He wore a gray vest lined with tools and had gentle eyes that always stayed on the creatures, not the people. "Bear will stay on this side," Denise explained, motioning to the outer pen. "Snowdrop will be led to the inner enclosure. We'll observe their reactions and record changes in behavior." As they approached, Bear pulled slightly but not out of excitement. He had seen something. Madison followed his gaze. Snowdrop stood at the far end of the enclosure, ears alert, her small body tense but upright. When Bear stopped moving, so did she. For a moment, there was nothing. Then Bear let out a low exhale, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. Snowdrop took a step forward. Nico raised his eyebrows. "That's a first." Another step, then another. By the time Snowdrop reached the fence, she was no longer trembling. She paused a few feet away, head tilted. Bear didn't move, didn't whine. He simply sat down tall and still like a sentinel. Snowdrop lowered her head slightly and took one final step forward until her nose nearly touched the chain link. They stood like that for several minutes, no barking, no bleating, just a quiet exchange no one else could hear. "It's like they're talking," Eli whispered. Madison nodded, feeling a sting behind her eyes she didn't want to explain. Eventually, Bear lay down his side to the fence. Snowdrop mirrored him from the other side, curling gently into the grass. Denise scribbled notes, Nico took photos, but no one spoke above a whisper. When it was time to leave, Bear didn't resist. He stood calmly, gave the fawn one final look, and turned without being led. Back at the truck, he jumped into the back seat without hesitation, and Madison saw something different in his posture, not peace maybe, but ease, a loosening. That night something changed at home. Bear didn't sleep by the door. Instead, he lay near the fireplace, close enough to feel the warmth. Eli brought over his sketchbook and sat beside him, cross-legged on the rug. He didn't draw immediately. He just watched Bear breathe. "Can I touch him?" Eli asked. Madison paused in the doorway, holding a folded blanket. "If he lets you." Eli reached out slowly. Bear turned his head slightly, then dropped it onto his front paws again. His body remained relaxed. Eli rested his hand on Bear's back. That same night, Madison did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She walked into the living room, reached up to the bay window, and pulled aside the heavy curtain that had hung like a tombstone since Dean's funeral. The window had been covered so long, it took her a moment to recognize the view. But there it was, the forest, the soft arc of the moon over the pines, and the stars scattered like broken glass across the sky. The next morning, Bear ate his full breakfast. Not rushed, but willingly. He even licked the bowl. Later, Madison found Eli sketching by the kitchen table again. He had drawn Bear and Snowdrop side by side, their silhouettes blending into the same shape, half wolf, half deer, connected by a line of breath. "You're healing," Madison said softly, though she wasn't sure if she meant the drawing the boy or the house. Maybe all three. The wind had changed in Silver Hollow. It wasn't just the scent of early spring in the air, the wet earth thawing pine and distant rivers cracking free of their icy chains. There was something else, something quieter, a tension, as if the forest was waiting for a question to be answered. Madison noticed it first in the way Snowdrop stood. For 2 days after the visit, the young albino fawn had been improving. She had taken small steps, eaten a few mouthfuls of hay, even responded to the vet tech's voice. But by the third morning, she was curled again in the corner of her pen, motionless. When Madison offered food, she turned her head away. When Nico clapped gently to test her response, she barely blinked. "Something's shifted," he said, frowning as he watched her from across the gate. Madison knelt beside the fencing. Her vitals are holding, but she's retreating again. It's like she's waiting, or giving up. Nico crossed his arms. Animals don't give up unless something inside them already has. Bear hadn't eaten either. He lay at home near the fireplace, unmoving eyes distant. His body looked heavier somehow, not from weight, but from stillness. He didn't rise when Madison called, didn't respond when Eli approached, though his eyes followed the boy with a flicker of awareness, like memory, without the energy to act on it. Madison sat beside him late that night, her hand resting on his back. The fire crackled gently. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. "She's fading," she whispered. "And so are you." Bear didn't move, but his tail twitched once, a barely there gesture, as if he had heard something she could not. The next morning, Madison made the call. "I want to bring him in," she said to Denise. "One more time, just let him see her." There was silence on the line, then a sigh. "If it helps her, we'll allow it, but it has to be brief, no direct contact." That afternoon, they returned to the center. The sky had turned a soft slate gray, and the trees swayed under the kind of wind that seemed to carry voices from long ago. Bear walked without a leash, close at Madison's side, but without his usual alertness. Eli trailed behind, sketchbook clutched in his arms, a new drawing half-formed inside. They were led around the back to a smaller pen, where Snowdrop now stayed alone. Denise waited near the enclosure, clipboard in hand, and Nico stood at a distance, arms tucked into his vest. "She hasn't eaten since the day after he left," Denise said quietly. "We've tried everything." Madison nodded. "Let's try this." Bear stepped toward the gate, his ears lifted slightly. Snowdrop remained curled, her body small against the straw, but her ears twitched one, then the other, when he stopped just outside the fence. He didn't bark, didn't whine. Instead, Bear let out a low, deep-throated rumble, not aggressive, not urgent. It was something deeper, older, like an echo of a sound that once lived in the wild, a vow made in another language. Snowdrop lifted her head. Eli gasped, his voice barely more than breath. She heard him. The fawn didn't rise, but her eyes opened wide and her body shifted. A long pause, and then slowly her neck extended toward the fence. Madison stepped back, hands to her chest. Bear repeated the sound a little softer, this time more of a hum. Snowdrop's nostrils flared. Nico gently passed a small bottle through the side of the pen, held it out just within reach. Snowdrop didn't hesitate. She leaned forward and drank. It wasn't much, just a few sips, but it was enough. Madison turned away, eyes shining. Eli stepped beside her and whispered, "It's like when Dad came to me in my dream." Madison looked down. "You never told me that." Eli nodded. "I didn't want to lose it by saying it out loud." She crouched beside him, one hand brushing his shoulder. "What did he do?" Eli looked at Bear. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. Like Bear. Inside the pen, Snowdrop had finished drinking. She lay down again, but this time facing the fence. Bear didn't move from his post. He sat like a statue, gaze fixed on the fawn, breath even. Denise stepped forward. "We'll monitor her closely." This might be the turning point. On the ride home, Bear sat in the back seat, ears upright again. He didn't lie down. He stared out the window as if expecting something, or remembering something important. Eli sat beside him, flipping through his sketchbook. On one page he had drawn a figure of Bear standing before a tree line, and in the trees a pair of glowing eyes. Snowdrops. When they arrived home, Bear ate a full bowl of food. Then, for the first time since he had entered the house, he walked into Eli's room on his own and lay down at the foot of the bed. That night the wind howled softly through the forest. But inside the house it was quiet, no pacing, no silent mourning, only the soft rhythm of breathing from a boy and the dog who had chosen to stay. The forest shimmered with new life. Snow clung to the north-facing hillsides and patches, but along the trails the ice had receded, leaving soft mud and the early bloom of wild violets pushing through the ground. The canopy overhead whispered in the breeze, branches no longer groaning under the weight of winter, but moving freely as if sighing in relief. Madison stood beside the open transport crate at the edge of the wildlife preserve, arms crossed tightly over her jacket. Beside her, Eli squinted toward the tree line. He wasn't holding his sketchbook this time. His hands were empty, fingers twitching slightly at his sides. Bear sat beside them, unmoving. His thick coat ruffled gently in the wind, ears forward, eyes locked on the white blur stepping into the open. Snowdrop emerged with delicate, hesitant steps, her pale legs sinking into the wet grass, then lifting again. Her coat, though thinner than it had been, glowed faintly in the filtered morning light. She paused just outside the crate, her head turning, slightly not toward the trees, but toward Bear. Bear didn't move. Eli held his breath. Madison glanced toward the trees where two wildlife techs stood a respectful distance away. One of them was a lanky young man named Jared, with shaggy blonde hair and a kind, sleepy expression that never seemed rushed. The other was Melinda, a short woman in her 40s with wiry limbs and a voice like cold wind, sharp, direct, but fair. They'd been working with Snowdrop for weeks and had pushed back her release twice before this. "She's ready now," Melinda had said that morning, "even if she doesn't know it yet." Snowdrop took a step forward, then another. And then, without warning or drama, she turned and walked into the trees. Not fast, not panicked. Just a steady movement forward, like a thread finally unspooling toward the place it was meant to end. Bear watched. His head tilted slightly as she passed the second birch tree and disappeared into the underbrush. Then he exhaled one long, quiet breath. Not a whine, not a howl, just a release. He didn't chase her, didn't cry, just stood there, chest rising and falling, then slowly turned and walked back toward Madison and Eli. Eli crouched beside him. "She's okay now," he said softly. Bear nudged his shoulder gently, the closest thing to a nod he would ever give. On the way home, no one spoke, not out of sadness, but out of something deeper, an acknowledgement that something had just ended and something else had quietly begun. Bear sat calmly in the back seat, his head resting on the window ledge, watching the passing trees as though mapping the silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Madison didn't go straight inside. She paused by the porch, looking at the yard that had long felt like a forgotten corner of her life. Something about it now felt different, less empty. Bear stretched on the grass, rolling, once then resting with his eyes half closed, as if the tension he'd carried for so long had finally eased. Later that day, Eli stood at the kitchen table with his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Can I take Bear with me to school?" he asked. Madison raised an eyebrow. "To class." "Not inside, just walking there. It's not far." She studied her son. Eli's posture had changed in recent weeks. He stood straighter. His voice was clearer. His eyes, once guarded, now lingered longer on the world around him. "Sure," she said. "If he wants to." Bear, already by the door, stood up when Eli reached for the leash. That morning became a new ritual. Each weekday, Eli would walk Bear down the winding street toward the school bus stop. The neighbors took notice. A few nodded politely. Some waved. And one morning, Mrs. Weller, the retired librarian with large glasses and a fondness for lemon cookies, leaned over her fence to offer Bear a treat. "He's a good boy," she said with a small smile. Madison watched from the porch, arms folded, heart unusually still. And inside the house, something else shifted. She opened the storage room that had once housed crates of untouched medical supplies and began reorganizing. The clinic had been operational for emergencies only, But now she dusted the shelves, restocked medications, repaired the broken scale in the corner. On the door, she posted a handwritten sign, now accepting rescues and strays. That same afternoon, the first knock came. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, with windburned cheeks and too short sleeves, stood holding a cardboard box. Inside, a tiny kitten with crusted eyes and a mule so faint it seemed imagined. He introduced himself as Leo, a seasonal hiker from Montana, thin and a little jittery, with a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when nervous. I found her under a footbridge near Three Pines Trail, he said. Didn't know who else to call. Madison knelt, checked the kitten's gums, and motioned him inside. Bear, from his spot by the fireplace, lifted his head, sniffed the air, then resumed resting. Leo stayed for tea, said he'd be back through town in the summer, asked if she needed help fixing the outer fence. That evening, Madison sat on the porch steps watching the trees darken with dusk. Eli sat beside her sketchbook on his lap, drawing Bear curled in sleep, a new image of peace forming beneath his pencil. Snowdrop's release hadn't just freed her, it had untied something in all of them. Bear had not chased her into the woods. He had simply watched her go, and in doing so, he taught them all that sometimes love meant letting go. The town of Silver Hollow had always moved at the rhythm of wind and pine, a place where stories settled like snow and stayed through seasons. But something had shifted over the past few weeks, something small and quiet and profound. It wasn't in headlines or ceremonies, but in the glances people gave one another, in the silence that followed kindness, and in Bear. He had become, without announcement or fanfare, the soul of the town. Everywhere he went, people noticed. Children slowed their bikes when they passed him on his walks with Eli. Old men at the general store nodded to him like to an old friend. Even Rhonda Bell at the market, once suspicious of his untagged collar, now left out a small bowl of water beneath the register window. Bear didn't seek attention. He never barked, never begged, but his presence was felt. He sat outside the post office while Madison mailed letters. He waited by the school gate for Eli to return, ears perked still as a statue. He followed Madison through the newly reopened clinic, lying beside crates of rescued kittens, occasionally nosing the blanket of an injured fox, or warming the floor near a frightened stray. That spring, the town council approved a small community event, the first since the snow had thawed. It was meant to be simple, just a gathering at the town square to honor the volunteers who had helped with wildlife rehabilitation efforts during the winter. But the townsfolk had their own ideas. Flyers went up. Someone painted a mural. Angie Keller, the tattooed waitress from the diner, arranged live music. Local photographer Carla Jean, a freckled redhead with a mischievous grin and a camera always slung around her neck, offered to do portraits of rescue animals with their foster families. They called it the Healing Trail. Madison hadn't planned to attend at first, but Eli was adamant. It's not just about Snowdrop, he said. It's about Bear. He's why she made it. He's why we did. On the morning of the event, the town square bloomed with canopies and picnic tables. Hand-painted signs marked donation booths for the rescue center. A large bulletin board displayed photos, Snowdrop walking through a pine grove, a raccoon in recovery, a girl holding a possum in a towel, and there in the middle, a new photo taken by Carla Jean, without anyone noticing. Bear lying beside Eli, their shadows cast, long by the late sun. No leash, no tension, just presence. Near the stage, the mayor, Tommy Greaves, a short man with a mustache too wide for his face and a fondness for metaphors, cleared his throat and began to speak. He wore a pressed blue shirt and held a handwritten speech with more crossings out than sentences. "Folks," he said, glancing at the crowd, "I know we're not used to speeches, but today's not just about what we've done, it's about who we've become." He gestured toward the board. "We came together this winter for something bigger than ourselves. For animals that couldn't speak, for creatures that couldn't run, for hope that looked a lot like fur and feathers." He paused, searching the crowd. "And there's one among us who reminded us what it means to stay, to wait, to protect. A dog with no collar, no past, and more courage than most of us put together." All eyes turned toward Bear, who sat at Madison's feet unmoving. Bear, the mayor, said, "Thank you." No applause followed, only silence. The good kind, the kind filled with breath and respect. That evening, as twilight rolled in, soft and slow, the Harper family returned home. Eli raced inside, first dropping his jacket over a chair, then flopping down in front of the fireplace. Bear followed and curled beside him, his body warm against the rug. Madison stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight. Eli leaned his head against Bear's neck, humming something under his breath. Bear's ears flicked slightly but didn't lift. He was still content, his gaze distant but gentle. The fire crackled softly, the last light of day flickering on the walls. Later that night, Madison reached into a drawer and pulled out a form of official adoption papers. She filled in the lines slowly, carefully. Under name of animal, she wrote Bear. Under new owner, she wrote Madison Harper and Eli Harper. Then she signed it. She placed the form on the mantel and turned toward them. "We're your people now," she said softly. Bear didn't move, but his tail brushed the floor once. Before bed, Eli opened his sketchbook and drew for a long time. When Madison passed by, she saw the final image Bear lying in front of a fireplace. His eyes half closed, his ears turned not toward danger, but toward the sound of wind through distant trees. Not in fear, not in mourning, but in peace. The last guardian, the last keeper of the flame. Maybe the real miracle wasn't in the rescue, but in the waiting in a wounded dog who chose to stay when walking away. Would have been easier in a fragile creature who found warmth not from fire, but from the silent loyalty of another broken soul. Maybe God still speaks through fur and paws through quiet snow and steady breath, reminding us that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stays. In our daily lives, we often miss the small miracles, a kind gesture, a second chance, the decision to protect what others overlook. But those are the moments heaven leans in close. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember what goodness looks like. Comment below your thoughts or simply type Amen if you believe love still heals. Subscribe to join our family, and may God bless and protect all who are watching this right now.